Special effects used to be what made movies so thrilling and unique to experience. In the early years of the industry, Hollywood was a place that could make the impossible happen. Absolutely amaze audiences with how they were able to depict things that didn't seem possible in one's wildest dreams and actually show them on screen. But by the turn of the millennium, something started to happen, and it's gotten to the point that not only are special effects really not all that special anymore, but are a lot more likely to be ridiculed when they look bad, rather than praised for when they look good. And today, I'd like to go over what exactly inspired this change in attitude regarding how audiences view special effects. And there are going to be spoilers for a few of the movies I bring up ahead. So in case there's something you don't want ruined, you might just want to keep on the lookout. You have been warned. Okay, so to get the obvious out of the way first, the biggest reason for the shifting views on special effects can be boiled down to one thing: CGI. But it isn't so much that the animation form itself is the problem, although I did dedicate a video to the medium's limitations, which you can find a link in the description to. It's how dependent movies have become on it that's the real issue. I mean, when everything in a movie from props to costumes to the backgrounds are all CGI, and most of the time not particularly convincing at that, it's going to take away from the amazement that special effects like that usually evoke. Because not only is it being unnecessarily used everywhere, but it doesn't even look all that good. And as a result, only something like Avatar, which goes out of its way to try and make the CGI look as real, polished, and great as possible, can it evoke anything resembling what special effects used to. In other words, it's not so much CGI, but rather an overuse of it and a lack of effort that have caused many to start viewing it in a much more critical and disdainful light. And just for a contrast, take a movie like The Nightmare Before Christmas. Look at a scene like this and try to remind yourself that it's all stop motion. That people had to go to the trouble of moving everything in this shot the tiniest bit, take a picture, move everything the tiniest bit again, and then take another picture. Frankly, the effort that went into this movie is astronomical, and the fact that it looks so seamless, to the point that many would insist a CGI trickery had to be used when it wasn't, can leave many amazed even to this day. In other words, because stop motion is such a difficult form of filmmaking, the fact that it looks almost perfect is nothing short of breathtaking. And that's not even getting into the likes of Coraline, where many have actually mistook it for a completely CGI film. And again, one has to admit, it's a lot easier to appreciate the effort that went into these movies, because everything in them was actually built and tediously manipulated with human hands, rather than something that was created easily just by typing around on a keyboard. Or to go back even further, just take a look at the work of Ray Harryhausen. I mean, he did this stuff in the 60s, and a lot of it still holds up pretty well even all this time later. And what's even more impressive is, he did all of this by himself. With the sole exception of Clash of the Titans, every creature he worked on was animated by him and him alone. And even in the aforementioned movie, for the famous fight against Medusa, he actually managed to create moving shadows on a stop-motion puppet. Do you have any idea how hard that is when you can only move the model one frame at a time? To this day, stop-motion enthusiasts are not only amazed by what Harryhausen managed to accomplish, but are borderline baffled as to how he pulled some of it off. And that's not even getting into the fact that he often put himself to extra work just so his creatures would feel more real. Like, for example, in the 1951 film The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, for the scene where the dinosaur is running through New York, there's a quick moment where it stomps on a car, reacts to it confused, snarls at it, steps over it, and then accidentally starts dragging it with its tail. Now here's the catch. None of that was scripted. The dinosaur was just supposed to step on the car and keep going. But Ray Harryhausen put himself through days of extra work just because he wanted to make it move and behave the way a real animal would. He did all of that for details few would even notice or appreciate. And that's only just one example of that. There are plenty of other times he did that throughout his films. To put it simply, there's a reason Ray Harryhausen is considered one of the best stop-motion animators of all time, and it's because his creations not only looked surprisingly convincing for their time, but for the staggering amount of effort he put himself through to make them look and feel that way. And honestly, the same very much applies to the original King Kong all the way back in 1933, even if it's a lot harder for most to appreciate because of how primitive the effects were. But I've already made my case for why the effects should be more appreciated in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to in case you're curious. So all I'll say here is, most will never understand or appreciate what Willis O'Brien actually went through to create King Kong. And that's why people are so hard on CGI now. Because it used to take effort for the more amazing and elaborate shots in films to be brought to life. And CGI makes all of that way too easy, so it makes it that much more difficult to appreciate. I mean, can you really compare the level of effort Ray Harryhausen went to with his dinosaur to the Indominus Rex in Jurassic World? Especially because when all's said and done, they both evoke about the same level of realism despite being made 65 years apart. Which either means that Harryhausen was extremely ahead of his time with his stop motion, thereby making it even more impressive, or the studio was cutting corners with the CGI. But this extends far beyond just stop motion, to pretty much any effect that's easily done with CGI now. As I said before, it's a lot harder to appreciate something when it can easily be done on a computer, when once upon a time, people had to go to a lot of effort, sometimes even risk their lives, to get the shots they wanted. That's why things like Moses parting the Red Sea in the Ten Commandments, or the famous chariot race in Ben-Hur are so beloved even today, because the effects you see were almost impossible for their time. But they went out and did them anyway. And particularly in the case of Ben-Hur, knowing that what you're seeing is real, and that the actors had to actually endure what's on the film, with quite a few stuntmen and Charlton Heston almost getting seriously injured multiple times, makes the final product a lot more impressive. Because it's not actors just sitting in place with a blue screen behind them or computerized wagons falling over. The danger, to an extent, is very real, and the fact that they did it anyway really shows how dedicated they were to bringing the director's vision to life. And that's just something CGI can never evoke, no matter how, quote, real it looks. Or take a look at this from Mr. Peabody and the Mermaid, filmed in 1948. That's no actress in a harness with the water and tail added in later. That's a real woman swimming with a prop tail on while holding her breath underwater. The actress in question, Anne Blyth, even said that the most difficult part of filming was learning how to swim with the tail on, but she did it anyway, because back then, that was the only way a mermaid could be depicted in her natural habitat in a live-action film. And because of that, her work on the film is still very well regarded by film experts to this day, because it wasn't easy for her to do, and yet she completely sells you on the fact that she's a mermaid. As I noted before, it's the fact that special effects were almost more convincing back then, and that there was a lot more effort that had to be put into them, that makes many view CGI as inferior. Because not only is it way less work, but most of the time it's not even that convincing. As I even said in the CGI video, most of the time, CGI isn't really all that impressive. There's only a few select times that it really holds up, and most of it is from older movies. While on the flip side, not only did a lot of these older movies work hard for their more spectacular moments, but they hold up a lot better at that. Like, for example, these actually look like real explosions because they are real explosions, not just computer simulations. As the old saying goes, you get what you put into something. And because the director actually put in the effort to make the explosion he wanted, it ends up looking a lot better as a result. But I already dedicated a whole separate video to this, which you can also find a link in the description too. And there is one other thing that should be mentioned here, which is makeup effects. Because even the best motion capture technology, with, once again, the exception of the likes of Avatar, has never really been able to completely sell the fact that a given character is actually interacting with the humans around them. Something just never looks quite right about them. As I even mentioned in one of the aforementioned videos, even Thanos, who was given special attention to look as real as possible, never completely sells himself as such. And if you don't believe me on that, just take a look at when Thor shoves the axe into his chest. The way his head interacts with both Chris Hemsworth's hand and the background pretty clearly gives away that he's a digital creation superimposed in after the fact. And indeed, if you look at behind the scenes footage, you can clearly see that Josh Brolin's head is nowhere near where his is. Hence why Thor putting his hand behind his head isn't the most convincing. Now that's obviously not to take away from the work that was put into him. I'm just trying to point out why people are often so critical of CGI, because even when extra effort is put in, it still doesn't always do its intended job of looking real. But some of the makeup jobs done throughout movie history are simply mind-blowing. If you didn't know any better, you'd positively swear that what you were seeing was actually real and not the creation of a makeup artist. And some of this goes back as far as the 1950s. Even The Wizard of Oz from 1939 try to tell me that a lot of the effects, but especially the makeup, don't hold up better than they had any right to. And it's even more impressive when you consider how little they actually had to work with, and it still looks incredible. Honestly, I could go over many examples of makeup effects that were simply amazing. But if I had to pick just one to save time, it would have to be the 1985 film Legend. Now there are a lot of great makeup effects here, like Meg Mucklebones for example. Tell me she doesn't look like a swamp creature out of a child's worst nightmare. Or even the goblin creatures in this scene. They all look like something right out of a fairy tale storybook. And, of course, there's the movie's most amazing effect, which is that of its villain, Darkness. I mean, look at this guy. and he is all makeup, no computer effects at all. Some have even argued that this character is one of the best examples of a character brought to life through makeup in all of film history. And is it really any wonder why? Not only would you never know that was Tim Curry under there, which it is, but if viewed in isolation, you would totally believe that he was the devil come to drag you off to hell. And I'm sorry to say it, but no CGI version of this could ever achieve the same results. And that's not even getting into how much of a nightmare it was for Tim Curry to deal with all that makeup, as he had to walk on stilts while performing, hurt his neck due to the harness used to support the horns, and even ripped off large amounts of his skin after he got claustrophobic and took the glue off before it was properly melted. Now, to be fair, Ridley Scott did go out of his way to try and make things more comfortable for Curry after seeing just how bad it was for him, but it still speaks volumes that he was willing to do the movie even under such circumstances, as well as his acting abilities, considering that he's able to do such a convincing job as the ruler of all evil while being so uncomfortable. But I've already dedicated other videos to singing his praises as an actor. My point is, it may have cost a lot and taken its toll, but ultimately the effects were some of the best ever put on film as far as bringing a mythical creature to life goes. And that's why people appreciate it so much more, because not only did it require a ton of effort to pull off, but it still looks just as convincing as it did in 1985. And that's something CGI has rarely been able to achieve even at the best of times. So as I've already noted a few times, what used to make special effects special was that they actually looked real and convincing, but also how much effort was generally put into them in order for them to look that way. But in the modern age, studios have become way too dependent on CGI to solve every problem, which not only causes them to use it when they shouldn't, but is also a lot more apt to make people notice when it isn't good. Because a lot of old school special effects were used more sparingly, it was more difficult to spot the flaws with them. And even if they weren't always top notch, many were willing to overlook it because of the immense amount of effort that still went into them. But CGI has neither of those luxuries. It's used all the time, and is much easier, relatively speaking, than anything else I went over. I mean, I don't want to trivialize the work of these animators and what they have to go through, as it can be very grueling, but one has to admit that they still have it way easier than what Tim Curry, Ann Blyth, or Charlton Heston did. The problem mainly lies in that the studios just don't seem to understand that CGI isn't always the answer. Just because something can be done with CGI doesn't mean it shouldn't be done another way. In other words, just because CGI is capable of doing something doesn't mean that's automatically the best way to do it. In many cases, the more practical, if slightly more difficult, old school approach does yield better, more realistic results, as many of the movies I've gone over perfectly demonstrate, as they still hold up all this time later. To put it very simply, if special effects are to be considered genuinely special and be more appreciated like they used to, then the right balance has to be struck between the older effects and CGI, as that'll not only allow the effects to be better, but make the audience less critical when CGI is used. Because the only thing an over-reliance on CGI has achieved is making the studios look lazy and for the audience to resent its usage, since the intended effects usually don't look anywhere near as good as the ones done decades earlier. Alright, that's everything I had to say on that. But now it's your turn to tell me. Do you believe that the main reason why many aren't impressed with special effects anymore mainly comes down to studios overusing CGI, which inevitably makes them look lazy when it's not up to snuff? Or do you believe it's for entirely different reasons that many have become way more critical of movie magic? Please let me know in the comments below. And please keep in mind that everybody will have a different opinion on this subject. So if you think I was wrong about everything I just went over, that's completely okay. And thank you all for watching. I very greatly appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.